The woman was tied to the bed and couldn't escape. A disheveled figure with a skeletal body stood up from the foot of the bed. It had a body entirely made of bones. The demon made a threatening gesture towards the woman. Suddenly, the woman's body aged several decades, becoming frail and old. Her piercing screams echoed through the roof. The story begins on a night 30 years ago. A girl was playing with mice in the storage room. At that moment, screams of the woman came from upstairs, accompanied by the violent shaking of the house. Blood kept flowing from the gaps in the floorboards upstairs. The girl covered her ears and curled up in the corner. Time swiftly moved forward to the present. 30 years later, the little girl has now become a mother herself. Her name is Nancy. On this day, she forgot to pick up her daughter from school due to a private meeting with a colleague. Nancy even forgot to pick up her daughter after school. Fortunately, Nancy's mother didn't forget. On her way back home, she saw a homeless man wandering nearby. As she arrived home, a police friend from the neighborhood came to inquire about the situation. It turned out that the police were searching for the homeless man. Some people heard that he had dug up something strange in the nearby swamp. By evening, the swamp was shrouded in thick fog. The homeless man seemed to be driven by a mysterious force. He was digging something in the swamp, until the whispers in his ears suddenly stopped. His movements came to a halt as well. He stood up and turned around. He found a peculiar figure approaching him. The next day, the homeless man was found dead in the pit. Soon after, an archaeological team arrived at the scene. The reason the police were searching for the homeless man was that, 4 days earlier, he had dug up a female corpse. No one expected that he died in the pit he dug. The forensic examiner concluded that he most likely died from a heart attack. On that night, Nancy's entire family had nightmares. Her mother experienced severe convulsions in her dream. When Nancy was taking her daughter back to her room, she suddenly noticed someone outside the window. The person vanished in an instant. Nancy's father believed it was a member of the archaeological team, because they were the only ones staying nearby, with no other residents around. The next day morning, Nancy's father confronted someone. Nancy had a fondness for the team leader, Walter. Her mother experienced convulsions during her dreams. Later, Nancy brought her to the hospital. Based on their conversation with the doctor, her mother has been experiencing problems for a long time. Nancy's father installed cameras on a tree by the doorstep to catch the intruder. Whenever someone passes by, it triggers the automatic photo-taking function. That evening at the bar, Nancy happened to meet Walter from the archaeological team. The two of them happily shared interesting anecdotes. On their way back, Walter asked about Nancy's experiences. When Nancy was very young, her grandmother was murdered. The killer has never been found to this day. Later, her father became mentally confused. Her mother developed a strange illness. They went to many hospitals, but there was no solution. To escape it all, Nancy went to New York alone. There, she met her boyfriend. Later, she gave birth to a daughter. Not long after, her boyfriend sadly passed away. Walter felt that Nancy's family was cursed. Nancy noticed the reaction. She decided to keep her distance. Every year, the town holds a stage play to commemorate a local legend. At night, Nancy's father keeps watching outside to prevent outsiders. When Nancy returned, she found that the door to her house had been opened. There was also a strange man in the kitchen. Nancy hurriedly went to find her mother. Her mother intended to cover for Nancy and go upstairs. However, the man suddenly pulled them down on the stairs. Then, he had a painful expression and let out a wail similar to a woman. Nancy's mother had originally intended to scare him away with a knife. However, the knife was taken away. She almost stabbed herself instead. At a crucial moment, Nancy's father arrived just in time. He used a hammer to knock out the intruder directly. Soon the intruder was taken away in an ambulance. The police also arrived at the scene and conducted further investigation. It turns out that the intruder was a member of the archaeological team. His name is Bill. Upon hearing this news, team leader Walter came over immediately to apologize. Team leader Walter has known Bill for many years. This person has a very kind heart. Now that he has done such a thing, Walter also feels that he is very unusual. After listening to what the other person said, Nancy's father also thought of the previous homeless man, because the homeless man had a noticeable change in his temperament before the incident. Previously, when Nancy mentioned the family curse, she thought it was a joke, but now she realizes that the curse may actually exist. Nancy's father can sense that misfortune seems to be repeating itself, so he hopes to move away as soon as possible. Nancy's mother has no intention of moving away at all. Then, Nancy's mother suddenly fainted inexplicably, but the hospital couldn't find any problems during the examination. When Nancy left, she unintentionally discovered that Bill was also in the hospital last night. At that moment, A girl by the hospital bed suddenly looked over. When Nancy left, the girl also followed her into the elevator. Inside the elevator, the girl said something that Nancy couldn't understand. She then extended her hand, and Nancy instinctively reached out to take it, but just at the moment they touched, the elevator suddenly malfunctioned. The girl initially spoke softly. Later, she seemed to see something terrifying. At the same time, Nancy, among flickering lights, noticed a horrifying face appearing behind her. Upon seeing this scene, she quickly turned around, but there was nothing behind her. The girl was already sitting on the ground in a state of exhaustion. Nancy returned to the car. She used translation app to translate what the girl said in the elevator. The translated content was unexpectedly that she had never died. At that moment, Nancy suddenly saw Walter also arriving at the hospital. She wanted to go and inquire about Bill's situation. Walter told Nancy that Bill had left the team before appearing abnormal behavior and had dug pits in other locations in the swamp. This is very similar to the homeless man. Nancy and Walter felt that this matter was not simple, because Nancy's mother had been urging her to go home. She could only arrange to meet Walter at the bar tomorrow. The next day, she came to the bar and encountered the homeless man's father. Nancy was very curious about what the homeless man had actually dug up. Walter told Nancy that it was a very old female corpse, estimated to be over 100 years old. Nancy seemed to have an idea, and she took Walter to find the homeless man's father. They learned that the entire homeless man's family inherited a certain gene that allowed them to perceive strange things, with the homeless man being particularly sensitive. Nancy speculated that the homeless man was able to dig up the female corpse because he had received some kind of information. The homeless man's father told her that it was the whispers of Helen, which originated from a local ancient legend known as the Fick legend. On the way back, Walter was very curious about who Helen was. Nancy was surprised that someone could be unaware, as the legend was very famous in the local area. Helen is the main villain in the entire Fick legend. She is similar to a monster in the swamp, often whispering in people's ears and abetting them to do terrible things. Nancy felt that the story was silly and that it was just meant to scare children away from the swamp. However, her father had actually heard it, and she thought she heard it too in the hospital elevator. Nancy wanted to know if the archaeological team had made any other discoveries, but Walter didn't intend to reveal more, because he was worried it would make Nancy more paranoid. Nancy instantly became unhappy and got out of the car directly. Walter, concerned about her, followed after her. Seeing this, Nancy smiled happily and even kissed Walter. They spent a pleasant night together. It was late when Walter finally returned to the marsh camp. The team members found similar female corpses in other pits, although the bodies were from different time periods. Their throats were all vertically cut. There was also a team member who appeared to be behaving strangely. Late that night, Nancy's father's camera was triggered, and the next day, he showed the photos he took to his police friend. Nancy's father felt that he had captured a face in the photos. On this day, the stage play in the town was about to begin, and the female assistant of the archaeological team found detailed records about the legend. Centuries ago, this land was ruled by an evil nobleman who, along with his wife Helen, possessed immense wealth. However, they were extremely harsh towards the common people. Before long, the nobleman made a maid pregnant. When his wife found out, she believed her husband had been enchanted by a witch. The pregnant maid prayed to God in the dungeon, but God did not respond. Another deity, the god Moloch worshipped by pagans, took notice of her. The deity promised to help the maid escape her unfortunate fate, but in return for seeking vengeance, she had to sacrifice her own offspring, even the descendants of her offspring. The maid made a deal with the pagan deity, and the mark of Moloch appeared on her forehead. On the day of judgment, Helen ordered her to confess and admit she was a witch, but the maid refused. She directly cut her throat vertically, and as her soul flew out from the incision, Helen's soul was also expelled. The maid's soul took over Helen's body, and she changed the nobleman's way of ruling. Under her influence, the people have finally lived a happy life. To commemorate the maid, the locals perform a stage play every year to reenact this story. The maid's name is Fick, and this is the legend of Fick. After the soul of the nobleman's wife Helen departed her body, she has been lingering near the swamp, filled with hatred and longing for revenge. She would use whispers to enthrall people and lead them to commit violence. The camera shifts to Nancy's side. She inadvertently discovers that her daughter has drawn a terrifying woman, identical to the one she saw in the hospital elevator. She asks her daughter who the person in the drawing is, but her daughter says she just drew it randomly. On the way home, her daughter mentions overhearing a classmate's father saying that the legendary Fick was indeed a witch. Nancy and her mother don't pay much attention to it. Nancy's father is setting up bell traps in the woods, and Walter invites her to attend the town party later in the evening. Nancy plans to first find her homeless father, because she feels he might be able to help her unravel the mystery. When Nancy arrives, the homeless father attempts to hypnotize her. With the help of hypnosis, Nancy's consciousness goes back to the day her grandmother was killed. On that night 30 years ago, Nancy hid in a corner after hearing a woman scream, and bloodstains spread down from the upper floor. Later, she was carried out from the storage room by someone, and through the reflection on the glass, she saw her grandmother's throat being slit vertically. This scene scared Nancy awake, and all the fish behind her died inexplicably. After leaving, Nancy went straight to the swamp camp, where the archaeological team had already found 8 female bodies with their throats slit vertically. Nancy felt that misfortune might befall her again, so she immediately went back to pack her things and prepare to move. Nancy's mother seemed somewhat reluctant. On the other side, the suspicious archaeologist was attempting to approach Nancy's house, when he was sneak attacked and stunned by her father. Just as Nancy's father finished tying him up, he heard the bell traps in the woods being triggered. He went to investigate and found several figures approaching. To his surprise, Nancy's mother was leading the way. If the one in front of him is the ghost of his wife, then who is in the house? Suddenly, a whisper reached his ears, and he instantly transformed, because Nancy intruded into the camp. The assistant of the archaeological team rushed to inform Walter. Walter thought of the tragic experience of Nancy's family, and he couldn't blame her either. Upon hearing this, the assistant of the archaeological team casually asked if her grandmother's throat was also slit vertically. If the local legend about Fick is true, then it may signify that the covenant Fick made with the spirits is still ongoing, and the women in Nancy's family might become sacrifices. Walter also sensed that things were not going well because he couldn't reach Nancy by phone. He immediately rushed to Nancy's home. On the side of the woods, the spirits had already arrived outside the house, and Nancy's father had also joined them. Nancy finished packing her luggage and was just about to leave. Nancy's daughter noticed something abnormal about her grandfather. Not only was he staring blankly, but he also broke the window trying to open the door. Upon seeing this, Nancy quickly pulled out the key. At the same time, she realized that the back door seemed to be left open. Nancy instructed her daughter to hide in the storage room and not come out. Nancy's mother had just locked the back door. Nancy's father forcefully burst through the door. When Nancy arrived, she saw her father intending to kill her mother. She hurriedly intervened to stop her father, and the shovel fell, causing Nancy to be thrown aside by her father. Nancy saw her own mother was choked and about to suffocate. Her father, however, wailed along with the ghosts outside as if their long-held grievances were being released. At this moment, Nancy noticed the shovel nearby, and she used it to knock her father unconscious. Nancy felt a strong discomfort at having to harm her own family. As she regained her senses, she realized her father was still lying on the ground, but her mother was nowhere to be found. She hurriedly went upstairs to search. A scream also startled her father awake from his unconscious state. Father arrived upstairs and saw his daughter Nancy unconscious on the bed. However, Nancy's mother suddenly attacked from behind and looped a rope around the man's neck. At that moment, the mother's eyes turned white, and her face wore an expression of her conspiracy succeeded. Subsequently, Nancy's father fell down the stairs, and he was instantly suspended mid-air. It turns out that Nancy's mother had long ceased to be herself. Meanwhile, over on the leader's side, Walter returned from town, preparing to find Nancy. However, he stepped on a trap in the woods. Not long after, a group of cultists arrived at Nancy's house. By this time, Nancy had changed into her pajamas and was tied to the bed, with her mother and the cultists standing by, watching her. Afterward, her mother comforted Nancy not to be afraid, but after saying that, she used a blade to cut her throat vertically. Nancy fell to the ground with her blood gushed out instantly. Then, a hand suddenly grabbed the bedpost, and when the face was revealed, Nancy realized it was the terrifying woman she had seen. She deduced that it was Fick, who was also the ancestor of the Nancy's family. At the same time, the cultists behind her knelt down. Fick lunged toward Nancy on the bed, causing her to experience intense convulsions. Instantly, her face became covered in aging wrinkles. Meanwhile, Nancy's daughter was in the storage room, witnessing the same events that Nancy had experienced before. Later, Walter managed to escape the trap and rushed over. By that time, Nancy's father had been hanged, and her mother had died from the throat cutting. Fortunately, Nancy was unharmed, and downstairs, her daughter was also fine. A few days later, the archaeology team prepared to leave the place, and Walter specifically invited Nancy to meet at the restaurant. He hoped that Nancy would consider moving somewhere else to live. He also helped Nancy find a suitable place to live. However, Nancy said she had already sold her violin, and mentioned that she didn't plan on moving for the time being. Walter had a strange feeling when looking at Nancy until she was about to leave. Nancy casually wrapped up the free sugar, and Walter instantly felt a chill down his spine, because it used to be Nancy's mother's habit. That night, the house was still surrounded by mist, and Nancy was sitting with her daughter, reading a storybook. Slowly, figures appeared outside the window. One of the ghosts was Nancy herself, the woman sitting beside her child, and astonishingly, she was Fick, who had made a deal with the cult. It turns out that the sacrifices never stopped, and Nancy's family would forever be trapped in this cycle of misfortune. The movie Moloch ends here. It is a Dutch horror film. In general, I believe the storyline is about how the demon transferred from Nancy's grandmother to Nancy's mother after her throat was cut. Then, when Nancy was tied to the bed, the demon moved from her mother's body to Nancy's body. The lead role soul is the same as all her ancestors' souls. She can only wander in the swamp next to the house. This is Fick's punishment. The overall plot of the movie is decent. When I was narrating, I deleted some unimportant subplots, and interested viewers can search for it to watch. Okay, thank you all for your support. See you next time.